Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well tonight. Another spoiler for you from MH2. Will I ever stop? No, or at least not until the set is fully released. And this is an Elves deck spoiler. It's not something I'm trying to jank my way into seeing it in Rock or anything like that. Elves, as a tribal deck, are actually my first love in Magic, both at the kitchen table and in terms of the first deck I ever ported into Modern about 5 years ago now, or maybe four and a half, something like that. Anyway, I am covering Elves today because Quirion Ranger is here in Modern with us. If it's Quirion, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce it the whole time. I think it's probably Quirion, but yeah, I don't have a good track record with the pronunciation game. Anyway, will it Elfball? Will this see play in Modern Elves? Absolutely yes. Now I have to shout out Lucas from the Discord who had a suggestion to call this Will It Roll. If you already kind of know the Elfball terminology, it's very clever because, you know, the elves all get together in a ball and they roll through everything, Will It Roll, and then it's kind of a nice pair with Will It Rock, and then if Deathrite Shaman ever comes out, we can say Will It Rock and Roll, and the answer will be yes. But I thought that might be a little bit too hard for people to grasp, just looking at a video, deciding to click it or not. So this is an Elfball video. Will it Elfball? Yes, Quirion Ranger is definitely strong enough to see play in Modern Elves. Thank you for watching. Let's break it all down for you. So you've got to look at the new printing while I did my introductory spiel, but now we're switching over to the Visions old border printing, which is my preference. The Elf's a little strange looking, but I do still like the card overall. The way the whole card goes together is absolutely elven, in my opinion. 10 out of 10 elf energy from old bordered Quirion Ranger. So she's a 1/1 for 1, and she's green. Very typical elf things going on there. But what is her activated ability, you might ask? Return a forest you control to owner's hand. That's the cost. The ability, once you pay that cost, untap target creature. Use this ability only once each turn. So, this is a card that is a little bit difficult for people who are newer to the game in general, certainly, or newer to Elves or haven't seen this card in action. It's difficult to figure out maybe what the big deal is. And at the end of the day, it's not a big deal insofar as it overturns the existing order of, like, what's good against elves and what elves struggle against and where elves excel in Modern. This is a little bit more of the same in that it's a very fragile dork. It rewards interaction, it rewards removal, it rewards, a static hate piece that hoses tribes like Plague Engineer, while it is going to go fast and go wide and ramp up to a big game-winning card. So none of that changes. But the path by which Quirion Ranger takes you there, that is what changes. It's really interesting. There's a lot of play to this card. Alright, so Llanowar Elves is your typical mana dork. You tap it, you add green, we all know what that does. Quirion Ranger is kind of a mana dork. She does not herself produce mana, but what you can do is make yourself a pseudo-dork by tapping a forest, floating it, and returning it to your hand, replaying it again. So if you don't have any other way to produce mana, Quirion Ranger becomes a mana dork alongside a forest in that regard. Now that's not perfectly efficient, right? Because you're only kind of getting a build your own Llanowar Elves out of the deal, and you haven't made a land drop. So if you've just flooded, you've got a handful of lands, you don't even get to deploy all your lands, you're just kind of treading water in that regard. So if that's all she really did, if there was no untap target creature clause, it'd be a bit of a weird card, not a particularly desirable one in most cases, but she untaps target creature. So remember, you can tap the land, float it, replay it. That's making 2 mana instead of just 1 out of that forest. But you can also untap a creature. Let's go back to that Llanowar Elves we used as a comparison. Well, it's also a synergy card. So Llanowar Elves plus Quirion Ranger plus a forest equals 4 mana per turn. It's kind of like an Arbor Elf and Utopia Sprawl combo. You basically tap the land, tap the dork, and then return the land to untap the dork. Then you get to replay the land, which of course enters untapped. So that is a build your own kind of Arbor Elf Utopia Sprawl synergy, as we say. But the reason they don't just play Utopia Sprawl instead of this type of stuff is because Quirion Ranger is an elf. It can turn sideways, it can contribute to Elvish Archdruid mana, it can of course get Anthemed and end the game, it can contribute to Shaman of the Pack triggers, and speaking of Elvish Archdruid, How about a little bit of a higher ceiling play? How about using Quirion Ranger to do exactly what we just described with Llanowar Elves, except you're untapping Elvish Archdruid, and then you are making repulsive amounts of mana, even if your board is not apocalyptically wide. And at the end of the day, often that is your path to victory with Elves. That is how you use Heritage Druid to chain spells together, including maybe Realm Walker off the top to keep the spells coming. It's how you cast multiple Collected Companies per turn. It's how you cast Craterhoof Behemoth if you're playing that card, or it's how you cast multiple Collected Companies. No matter what your specific top end looks like, activating Elvish Archdruid twice per turn instead of once on the back of a single Quirion Ranger, it's going to help you get there. Now, there are other less obvious use cases too. So we mentioned just now the Heritage Druid go off turns, and that's definitely true. But sometimes you won't have everything lined up just so, but maybe using the untap ability of Quirion Ranger will allow you to get a third elf untapped after maybe you've cast one or two already in order to keep the chain going, maybe deploy one more spell, or another round of spells with Heritage Druid. So that's something you can do. It's a little less spectacular, but it is an unorthodox mana dork in that way with Heritage Druid, in addition to all the other ways we just talked about. And Nettle Sentinel as well. So I use this card as an example for a couple of reasons. Number one, Sentinel doesn't untap during your untap step. We all know why we play it. It's a 2/2 for 1. It combos like crazy with Heritage Druid going off. And I think all that type of stuff is going to be better, by the way, now that Quirion Ranger is in the deck, going to be more consistent. But if the opponent is an attrition deck, they're interacting heavily, sometimes you'll be at the mercy of your top decks and you can't even untap your 2/2. This can be a bit of a disaster on a empty board. If the opponent's like got you hellbent, you only have a few dorks on the field you're trying to beat down before they can recover and take over the game with really high card quality. Nettle Sentinel can't even untap unless you find a green spell, but Quirion Ranger will let that card untap, and in fact it lets any card untap. Remember, Quirion Ranger says, use this ability only once each turn. This is where we get into another kind of hidden piece of power from this card. Once each turn. That means only once on your own turn, right? Or, I should say, and once on your opponent's turn. So you can untap Nettle Sentinel as a blocker. You can give it kind of pseudo-vigilance after the fact. This is a little bit of an ambush potential against opponents who are not aware of that, or maybe have to make an attack into it even if they are aware of it. Another way that you can really blow the opponent out by activating Quirion Ranger to untap an elf on their turn is to untap a Llanowar Elf and Veil of Summer the opponent if they're going for main phase removal or some other blue or black effect to you or the board. Untap on their turn for free. Veil of Summer, thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. So how do we need to accommodate Quirion Ranger? Well, the first thing to note is that she says return a forest you control to owner's hand, not just any land, right? So that is absolutely a restriction, more than you might think if you haven't looked too closely at elf lists before, because most of the green-black lists, which of course is what's stock, you do see some of them playing Effect Shock land-based, but it's not mandatory. It might not even be all that common. Certainly it has not been common in the past. You're looking at leaning on cards like Blooming Marsh and Guiltleaf Palace, which are both fantastic, almost free bayous, basically, in the context of an Elves list. No longer can you afford to play them alongside Quirion Elves. You will have to pivot to Effect Shock land base, just like the rest of us, if you are indeed splashing black. Whether or not you're splashing black, if you're mono green, it might literally be all or almost all forests. Of course, even in a green-black list, you'll want probably a higher count of forests than you had before. This can reduce your consistency a little bit with color production. It can also enable some interesting plays, though. This Dryad Arbor is something that is now available to you as a fetch target, as a forest, as a Quirion Ranger target, right? Because you can bounce the Dryad Arbor maybe after assigning a block. That's kind of cool. Return it to its hand, untap a creature, maybe get some other value concurrently out of that. Now, as another consequence of this fetch shock, or at least forest-heavy mana base, because for all I know, the optimal shell could now be mono-green, that could be interesting, we could now maybe think about playing Arbor Elves, and that would take the functional mana dork count from 8 to 16, relative to the 8 dork green-black list. You have Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, and that's it for traditional dorks. And then you have a Heritage Druid that sometimes is a dork, and you get it. But then you could even play 4 Arbor Elves in this Forest build, and 4 Quirion Rangers. Now, of course, that leads to the question, what do you cut for that? I don't know. I'm not saying it's optimal to play that much acceleration. I'm just saying it is now on the table, even if you wanted to run a split just to hedge against random effects that could affect cards with the same name, right? That is now available to you, or you have your pick of the most stylish Elvish mana dorks. That is a thing too. But like I said near the beginning, Quirion Ranger does not necessarily, solve any of the systemic problems that afflict elves. It makes them better at what they already do. I'm confident in that. It's a very tricky and skill testing and fun and powerful card. I do definitely think it will see play. But aren't we still just dying to all the ping effects? Not necessarily. Just this is by the by, nothing to do directly with Quirion Ranger, except maybe with just yet another X1 in the deck, you want this even more. But people have been reaching for Ley Line of Vitality lately as a sideboard card, mostly in Elves, although I think I've seen it main deck before too. And this is basically, it's a green Ley Line, you can hardcast it. It's kind of realistic to hardcast this early in the Elves deck, by the way. But of course, ideally you have it down as an opening game effect, Antheming your team, giving you them +0/+1, and you get to gain life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. And as I just displayed here with all the interactions, all the synergies, all the ways to dump out your hand, you'll be gaining a ton of life that way. This is very good in multiple different ways against red decks or against any aggressive deck, really, letting you have a beefier board for combats and, of course, all the incidental life gain. Now, since we're talking about Elves and that Anthem, or that Ley Line rather, and also talking about MH2 spoilers, let's just briefly mention Sylvan Anthem. This one came out today, and this is actually potentially an Elfball card too. It's a green enchantment. Green creatures you control get +1/+1. That's pretty darn good. That's a 2-drop Anthem effect that cannot be removed. We have, what's it called? Elvish Clancaller, which is a 2-drop Lord, which is great, but that's a base 1/1, so that dies to Plague Engineer, that dies to Dart and whatever else, and then everything else either dies to Plague Man or, whatever the case is going to be. This doesn't. This is more resilient, and therefore it makes your team more resilient, and you also get ETB effects just like with Ley Line. Whenever a green creature enters a battlefield under your control, scry 1. So I'm not making any claims that this is good enough to replace any cards in the Elves deck, but it is a potential tool. We'll see how it goes. Also, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We'll just finish the video talking about the finishers, aptly enough. Craterhoof Behemoth, I think, is now more viable than it has ever been in Modern as a finisher. This, of course, is the Legacy Elves finisher of choice, or at least one of them. And one of the big reasons for that is the card that we're here to talk about today. Quirion Ranger is just that much more of a consistency tool, of a ramp engine, of a almost Swiss Army knife, but all in the mana dork sort of ways, or the mana production sort of ways, that makes it viable to try to hard cast an 8-drop, right? Because that's still a big task, even for a deck like Elves, and let's not forget Throsta Tempest's Roar also has been revealed in this set. This could do something in Elves along the line of Craterhoof Behemoth. I don't know if it's better. I don't know if we're going to want to displace anything for this, but again, just bringing that to your attention. Just another thing that Quirion Ranger could enable. Alright, my friends, so that is my rundown of Quirion Ranger. Those are my thoughts on why she will roll, why she will Elfball, or you could just say why she will ball, right? Anyway, there are some other interactions we didn't talk about here, like if you have a forest that generated an ETB, which maybe exists in Modern, but probably not good enough to play, or, more importantly, in older formats where land destruction is more powerful, you can actually blow out land destruction or kind of keep it at bay by threatening to bounce a land in response to their land destruction. So there's lots of tricks that Quirion Ranger has up her sleeve. I think I've covered the main ones here. If there are any others you want to share, please leave them below. And also, who knows what the future of MH2, let alone the future of Modern as a whole, will bring. She might have game against unforeseen technology, but as it is, I definitely think she will go into Modern Elves, and it'll be really interesting to see what the optimized shell looks like once we have the full spoilers and people get to do a little bit of testing. So thank you so much for watching. Probably back to our regularly scheduled mid-range spoilers after this, but I couldn't couldn't let a Legacy and Pauper Elf staple go by without commentating on it here for you. So thanks again, guys, and I'll see you for the next one.